يسومونكم سوء العذاب يذبحون أبناءكم ويستحيون نساءكم وفي ذلكم بلاء من ربكم عظيم وفي ذلكم بلاء من ربكم عظيم وإذ فرقنا بكم البحر فأنجيناكم وأغرقنا آل فرعون وأنتم تنظرون وإذ وعدنا موسى 40 ليلة ثم اتخذتم العجل من بعده وأنتم ظالمون ثم عفونا عنكم من بعد ذلك لعلكم تشكرون. الشكر لله والحمد لله. وإذ آتينا موسى الكتاب والفرقان لعلكم تهتدون. وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم إنكم ظلمتم أنفسكم باتخاذكم العجل فتوبوا إلى بارئكم فاقتلوا أنفسكم ذلكم خير لكم عند بارئكم فتاب عليكم إنه هو التواب الرحيم. وإذ قلتم يا موسى لن نؤمن لك حتى نرى الله جهرة فأخذتكم الصاعقة وأنتم تنظرون ثم بعثناكم من بعد موتكم لعلكم تشكرون. الشكر لله والحمد لله. وظللنا عليكم الغمام وأنزلنا عليكم المن والسلوى كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم وما ظلمونا ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. وإذ قلنا ادخلوا هذه القرية فكلوا منها حيث شئتم رغدا ادخلوا الباب سجدا وقولوا حطة نغفر لكم خطاياكم وسنزيد المحسنين. فبدل الذين ظلموا قولا غير الذي قيل لهم فأنزلنا على الذين ظلموا رجزا من السماء بما كانوا يفسقون. وإذ استسقى موسى لقومه فقلنا اضرب بعصاك الحجر فانفجرت منه 12 عينا قد علم كل أناس مشربهم كلوا واشربوا من رزق الله ولا تعثوا في الأرض مفسدين. وإذ قلتم يا موسى لن نصبر على طعام واحد فادع لنا ربك يخرج لنا مما تنبت الأرض من بقلها وقثائها وفومها وعدسها وبصلها قال أتستبدلون الذي هو أدنى بالذي هو خير اهبطوا مصرا فإن لكم ما سألتم يعتدون. إن الذين آمنوا والذين هادوا والنصارى والصابئين من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر وعمل صالحا فلهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. وإذ أخذنا ميثاقكم ورفعنا فوقكم الطور خذوا ما آتيناكم بقوة واذكروا ما فيه لعلكم تتقون. ثم توليتم من بعد ذلك فلولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته لكنتم من الخاسرين. ولقد علمتم الذين اعتدوا في السبت فقلنا لهم كونوا قردة خاسئين فجعلناها نكالا لما بين يديها وما خلفها وموعظة للمتقين. وإذ قال موسى لقومه إن الله يأمركم أن تذبحوا بقرة قالوا أتتخذنا هزوا قال أعوذ بالله أن أكون من الجاهلين. قالوا ادع لنا ربك يبين لنا ما هي قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة لا فارض ولا بكر عوان بين ذلك ما تؤمرون. قالوا ادع لنا ربك يبين لنا ما لونها قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة صفراء فاقع لونها تسر الناظرين. قالوا ادع لنا ربك يبين لنا ما هي إن البقرة شابه علينا وإنا إن شاء الله لمهتدون. قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة لا ذلول تثير الأرض ولا تسقي الحرث مسلمة لا شية فيها. قالوا الآن جئت بالحق فذبحوها وما كادوا يفعلون. وإذ قتلتم نفسا فادارأتم فيها والله مخرج ما كنتم تكتمون. فقلنا اضربوه ببعضها كذلك يحيي الله الموتى ويريكم آياته لعلكم تعقلون. ثم قست قلوبكم من بعد ذلك فهي كالحجارة أو أشد قسوة وإن من الحجارة لما يتفجر منه الأنهار وإن منها لما يشقق فيخرج منه الماء وإن منها لما يهبط من خشية الله وما الله بغافل. أفتطمعون أن يؤمن لكم وقد كان فريق منهم يسمعون كلام الله ثم يحرفونه من بعد ما عقلوه وهم يعلمون. وإذا لقوا الذين آمنوا قالوا آمنا وإذا خلا بعضهم إلى بعض قالوا أتحدثونهم بما فتح الله عليكم ليحاجوكم به عند ربكم أفلا تعقلون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات الله.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, thank you for joining on the last night of the month of Ramadan. It's a sad time to be in, saying farewell to this month, and the last few minutes and last hour that we can take benefit of this this blessed time. We've benefited almost 10 days now, or 10 days from Shaykh Rizwan's lectures. On many of us learned many good things from them, men of conviction, bravery, men who stood by the Prophet and the Imams through their lives, and some other things to learn from them, things to stay away from. We're very thankful for all his lectures and all his teachings. As mashallah, even for me personally, I've been coming to lectures and programs all the time, and my horizons and there's just so much to learn on the subject that I've never been exposed to. So thank you so much for that. Inshallah, we'll have another lecture tonight, and then tomorrow we'll follow after the iftar with the few a'mal for the night of Eid. With a lot of salawat, please invite Shaykh Rizwan Arastu to the member, please.
محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا ذلك الفوز العظيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. For myself, this has been quite a journey. I started from the month of Ramadan, the beginning of it, and I had actually been collecting these lists of Sahaba names for many years, and whenever I saw a story in my reading, I would put it into a file. So I was collecting these. I still have, I think I have 50 or 60 of them that I hope to be able to develop into stories. But it's been a great opportunity for me to look at these different companions. I'll share a little bit about one last companion today, and then I'll give some closing remarks about the whole discussion, the whole series. The companion that we'll look at today is a companion of the 6th and the 7th Imams, and he actually dies in the time period of the 8th Imam. His name is Hisham ibn al-Hakam. Hisham ibn al-Hakam, there are two Hishams that are very prominent in a hadith. They're sometimes referred to as al-Hishaman, Hisham ibn Salim and Hisham ibn al-Hakam. So we're going to focus on Hisham ibn al-Hakam today. He came into the companionship of Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam very early in his age. He was a youngster, probably a young teenager. We don't know his age exactly, but 13, 14, something like that, it seems like, from the traditions that introduced him to us. He was already in kind of following another deviant sect called the Jahmiyyah. And so he was following that group, and he was very bright. He was very good with words. And the first encounter that he has with Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam is to challenge him. As a little kid, he asks his uncle, who has some relation with Imam Sadiq, can you introduce me to him, make an introduction, I want to come and debate with him. And so the uncle is a little bit hesitant. He says, I can't do that until I seek permission from Imam Sadiq first. So he does that. He goes and asks Imam Sadiq, is it okay? And Imam says, of course, yes, let him come. And as this uncle is walking out, he comes back and he says, but this nephew of mine is really, he has a really sharp tongue, and he's really, I'm afraid he'll be disrespectful to you. He might even be, he'll be very aggressive in his debating. And so the Imam says, you think I'm scared? You think I'm worried? Just let him come and I'll talk to him. And so he comes. And instead of letting him start, Imam Sadiq actually asked him some questions. And he's right away he's left speechless. He doesn't know the answer. So the Imam says, go and find the answer and come. He goes, he comes back, and again the Imam does the same thing. So a few times they have these exchanges, and the Imam tries to break his ego of encounters. Then I think on the second or third time, he asks for another appointment, so the Imam tells him to meet him somewhere. So they make some appointment in Hira, which is kind of, in the environs of Kufa. It used to be a large city in the ancient times, and then slowly as Kufa was being built, they took the materials, the building materials and the bricks from Hira, and they used it to build Kufa. So as Kufa was built, Hira was put into disrepair. So anyway, he says, I'll meet him there at a particular market. And so Hisham actually goes ahead of the appointment and waits there. And then after a while, when the appointment comes, Imam Sadiq comes riding a mule, and looking very dignified. When we think of mules, I think we think of like a donkey and a mule. We think of as kind of a lowly animal, like a cheap car or something like that. But from this tradition and even other traditions that describe the Prophet or others riding mules, this was considered a respectable way of traveling, especially within the city, it seems. On a horse, you'd go into battle, but in the city, when you're traveling around, you wouldn't ride your horse or maybe even your camel, which is for long distance travel. But the local travel within the city would be on a mule. So Hisham himself describes the sight. He says that as Imam Sadiq approached me on this mule, I was so overwhelmed by just the awe of his appearance that he came and he asks, what do you want to talk about? And he was speechless. Hisham just doesn't know what to say. And this is someone who is so sharp-tongued, always has a response in debates, and he just freezes. He doesn't say a single word. The Imam asks him a couple of times, sees he has nothing to say, and he rides off. And this was when Hisham says that I had a kind of a revelation that I'm on the wrong path. This is the person I should be following, and he decides to come into the under the tutelage of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. So one of the first encounters after this, it's narrated for there, and Hisham, so young that there's two little lines coming down. His beard hasn't even formed yet. He just has little sideburns. Conversion story. So now he's coming as a devotee, and in this gathering of Imam Sadiq, all the elders of the companions, who are every single one of them is probably 2 or 3 times his age, Hisham's age. They're all sitting in this gathering. He names Humran ibn A'yan, that's Zurara's brother, Qais al-Masir, Yunus ibn Yaqub, Abu Ja'far al-Ahwal. So all these really big names who are prominent companions of the 5th and 6th Imams, they're in this gathering, probably gray beards, elderly people, long culture. We'll have some things like this, but in their culture especially, there's a lot more decorum. So when you come into a gathering, the people who are at we have head of the table, maybe that's the closest thing we have. You have a long dining table, for instance. So the person you put at your head of the table, if you have an honored guest, you'll put him there. If you're coming into the dining room and your little son, like a little boy, comes and sits at the head of the table, you'll probably say, not you. Your time has not come yet, and you'll put one of the elderly people at the head of the table. So that's maybe some parallel that we have in our culture now. So if you imagine, this gathering and all these people are lined up on the side, the imam's at the head, and close to the door would be the lowest rung of the ladder. The youngest people go sit there, and here the Imam calls him and brings him all the way to the front and puts him right next to him. Salbihi wa lisanihi wa yadih. So the Imam sees that this is going against social norms, and everyone is a little bit either offended or at least put out of sorts by this break with convention that a young person's brought to the front when all of them have much more, they have full-fledged beards and gray hair, and he doesn't even have a beard yet. And so the Imam says that this is our helper with his heart and his hand and his tongue. Right? So he introduces Hisham like this to his companions. In that same gathering, it seems, same Lafdhul Jalala. So in that time, there's a lot of confusion, which now seems very simple to us. Like, how could they even be confused about this? But there's a whole chapter in Al-Kafi about this. People became confused about who we worship. Is it the name Allah that we call Lafdhul Jalala, or is it something beyond that? And what's the relationship between the name of God and God Himself? So for us, we might think that seems kind of a silly thing. Of course, the name Allah is not my God. The name Allah is simply a name for Allah Himself, who's the reality. But it's obvious for us, it wasn't obvious for them, and there was so much debate and confusion, people had to come to the Imams and ask for clarification on this. So Hisham asks the similar question based on the debates that were happening at that time, and he says, what's the etymology of Allah? Is it from Al-Ilah, or is it a name that's created for Allah Himself as a proper name? And so the Imam actually gives him a detailed etymology of the word, that it comes from Al-Ilah, it comes from the word Aliha, and he gives him all that detail. After speaking to him at length about this in this gathering with all these elders there, the Imam asks him, did you understand this? He says, أَفَهِمْتَ يَا هِشَامْ فَهْمًا تَدْفَعُ بِهِ أَعْدَاءَنَا الْمُلْحِدِينَ. So have you understood what I've told you, such that you can now defend our truth? So Hisham's response is, Na'am, yes I have. So then Imam Sadiq prays for him. He says, نَفَعَكَ اللَّهُ بِهِ وَثَبَّتَكَ عَلَيْهِ. May Allah allow you to benefit from this understanding and this knowledge that you have gained, and may He keep you steadfast in this knowledge. And so because this dua, then Hisham, he comments, he says that, like from that time when I was a child in the first presence of the Imam until the time when he's narrating the tradition, he says, ما قهرني فوالله ما قهرني أحد في التوحيد حتى قمت مقامي هذا. Like since that dua of the Imam to give me strength and give me understanding and the ability to be strong in my faith, nobody has ever been able to defeat me in any debate until this day of mine where I'm now speaking this hadith. Right, so this is the kind of relationship, this is how it started, and we see many debates between Hisham ibn Hakam and what are known as either mulhideen or thanawiya, so different kinds of people who rejected God or thought of God in the wrong sense, that there are two gods, a God of good and God of evil. There were some ideas, and of course, mukhalifin. Mukhalif is the term that's used in ahadith, and our older scholars use this for anyone who opposed the Imams. So now we use the term Sunni, for instance, but in the ahadith they would use the mukhalifun, those who oppose the Ahlul Bayt. And so he would debate with them as well. So there are many of these debates recorded in Al-Kafi. There's one instance I remember that it's in Kitab al-Hujjah al-Kafi where Imam Sadiq is with Hisham and some other people, and he wants Hisham to recount one of his debates with a atheist. And so he asks him, he says, I've heard about your victory in that debate with such and such atheist. Tell us, what did you say? What did he say? How did the debate go forth? So the others can learn from this. So Hisham very politely says, Ya Sayyidi, in your presence, I don't dare talk about such things. And the Imam, his response is, when I tell you to talk, talk. This is not time for being polite. I need you to teach the other companions, your comrades, what you did and how you succeeded in this debate so they can learn from you. It doesn't matter if I'm in your presence or not in your presence. When I'm telling you to do something, do it. Those kinds of interactions I find they're humorous, and they kind of bring these companions to life, and you see the regular people and they have interactions with the Imams like you can imagine between a teacher and a student even nowadays sometimes. One last tradition I'll share with you is also narrated in Al-Kafi. So we're told that Hisham comes to Imam Sadiq during Hajj time, and this is common. So he comes to the Imam and he has a list of 500 questions, he says, on different kalam issues, like theological issues that he's struggling with. And so he's collected these. He lives in Kufa, so he's come with these 500 questions, and he says that I would say, like, people are saying such and such, and the Imam would say, tell them such and such. And people say such and such, the Imam would say, tell them such and such. And he was kind of shooting these questions one after the other and probably writing the answers down very quickly, or maybe just memorizing the answers. When he's done with these 500 questions of his, he looks to the Imam and says that I knew before today that you were the most learned in fiqh, but these are kalam questions, these are theological questions. I didn't know that you knew this too. And this I find very curious and very interesting, and it's very insightful for us because we, in our position, looking back at history, we know the entire Imam. First of all, we know their names precisely. We know so much about them, and then we know beginning to end all of their teachings, and we have our theology all figured out who the Imam is, that he is someone who's just like the Prophet in terms of his knowledge, in terms of his even the mandate of what he does. Besides receiving revelation, he has whatever knowledge the Prophet had, and all of its expansiveness. Every part of Islam, the Imam has full knowledge of all of that. So it's clear for us And we assume that it must have been clear for those companions, especially someone like Hisham ibn al-Hakam, so close to the Imam, they would have seen it clearly. They just walk into the presence and you know the Imam knows everything, for instance. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't clear for them, and it took them time and interaction and questioning before they developed a full understanding of who the Imam is. And so here he has, he knows the reputation of the Imam, or he's seen him in action answering fiqh questions on Islamic law, and he's surprised that the Imam also knows something about another area of Islam. I think it's mind-boggling for us that someone so close could have that kind of uncertainty. We see a similar dynamic in terms of even identifying the successors to the Imams. I don't know if I shared any of these stories here, but in San Francisco where I was before, we talked about this, where there are instances, actually every Imam when he passed away, some of his closest companions would struggle. They would come in from Kufa and different places, and they would come to Medina and they would be wandering and so hopeless and they didn't know where to go because they didn't know who the successor to the Imam was. And they would go to the Banu Hashim and they would ask who is the most learned in the household. And sometimes we have a hadith where they would point them to another brother or someone else who was not qualified. And they would go and they would test them and they would ask them questions that they knew the answers to, and they would see he doesn't have the knowledge that we're supposed to have. And then finally they would find the Imam and then test him. He would succeed in the test, and then they would identify who the Imam was. And again, for us, that's a very strange dynamic, because we assume you just open a textbook, it tells you the Imams are there. Every Sunday school student knows who the Imams are by name. And we assume that the companions who are transmitting a hadith or in the presence of the Imam would obviously know all 12 Imams' names and exactly who the successor is, and they didn't. So one of the pitfalls of this dynamic is if you approach this dynamic from a secular point of view, and you see that people didn't know who the successor to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq was until some time passed, and then people settled on Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam. So the secular person who says there is no God, there is no prophecy, there's no such thing as miracles, there's no such thing as any sort of knowledge of the future or a knowledge of unseen, there is no unseen actually. So that person looks at this dynamic and they say, oh, well, what's happening here is that it's an afterthought. People, afterwards the Shia came up with a list of names, and then they had to rewrite history to say that, after Imam Sadiq, then there's confusion, and finally settled on Imam Kadhim alayhi salam, for instance. And this was an afterthought. It wasn't actually known from the beginning. It wasn't clear, and people had to debate and figure out, and then they settled on him, and then he had to kind of build his own imama and his own kingdom, and like that. So it's an afterthought. It's something that happened on the spur of the moment. It's very unsettling, and it can be actually very disorienting. It can even challenge our faith if we look at those academic writings and see this kind of analysis of this dynamic. When there's a difference between gradually disclosing some truth and inventing the truth as you go. Right? So it's not the case that they're inventing it as they go. One Imam dies, and now the Shia scholars themselves are trying to figure out who the Imam is. They decide, oh, you're the most qualified, let's make you the Imam. And let's add to the frills, and let's claim that you have this knowledge and that knowledge, and let's give you a couple of relics from your father, so you can say I have his ring and I have this and I have that. Let's make it, let's kind of make a show out of it so people believe that you're the Imam. He is the Imam from the beginning. That's decided, but the disclosing of that information, the discovering of that information, it takes time for these people primarily because of taqiyya, because of the danger that the Imams were in. If they are to make it clear ahead of time who the successor is, and they're just putting a bullseye on that person, that those who want to end this line of imamah, they're going to go after him and kind of cut him off before the imamah can even take off. And we have that for Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Mansur, the Abbasid Khalifa, he writes to his governor in Medina and says, as Imam Sadiq's on his deathbed, he said, look to what his wasiyah is and who he does wasiyah to, and whoever he does wasiyah to, kill him. And so Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he names 5 people in his wasiyah as his successor. One is his mother, one is Mansur himself, the Abbasid Khalifa, and Abdullah, and different people. These 5 different people, one of whom is Imam Kadhim, but he the water so that the governor doesn't know who to kill. He has to go kill his own Khalifa, for instance. But this dynamic was there, that they were constantly in fear, and they couldn't disclose these things. The same way, doubt arises, for instance, with Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, the first young Imam who's non-baligh by the standards of bulugh when he becomes Imam. And even in his own time, this became a huge challenge for people. It was the first time since Isa alayhi salam's time they thought that only happened in the past. In the Quran, we have the story of Isa alayhi salam, speaking from the cradle. But they'd never seen this in their own times, and they didn't think it happened now. All the Imams until now have been older people when they take up the Imamah, at least baligh, if not in their 20s. It was probably the youngest they had before that. And now all of a sudden they have a 7-year-old who's taking over the Imamah. And so even for the Shia, even for the companions, it became a crisis. They knew he was the Imam, they didn't have the doubt there, but they said he obviously can't do the job just yet, so who's going to take over, who's going to fill the void until he becomes baligh and old enough to take over the reins of Imamah. And so even those companions had to travel from far off places to come to Medina to figure out what's the game plan now until he becomes baligh. And then they were able to encounter him and test him, and they saw that actually he has the knowledge of his father, and there's no need for him to grow up and learn something. He's been endowed this knowledge from supernatural means and through Allah's own guidance and providence. So the secular mind will look at that dynamic and say, oh, there was a crisis in the Imamah after the 8th Imam's death, and there's nothing else to do. He had no other sons. There's a young boy. They had to somehow make up a whole story that he's the Imam, and make up stories to show that he's worthy of this position. So my point is that when you read these kinds of secular descriptions of the history of our Imams and of divine history, we have to realize that that's not unbiased. Right? Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking if someone else writes our history, then that's unbiased, and if we write our own history, that's biased. Unless you consider bias to be looking at things with a lens of belief in God, knowing that God exists, knowing that prophethood exists, knowing that successorship and wasaya to the prophets exists, and that the ilmul ghaib and knowledge of Quran and all these things are there with the Imams, just like the Prophet. If you call that a bias, fine, but that's not a bias that's just because of my personal whims and what I feel like and what I like. It's a lens to produce miracles to prove themselves, and even a child like Isa alayhi salam or Imam Jawad can be very young and have all the qualities of a prophet and a guide that's necessary. We see that people like Nuh alayhi salam can live for very long times, and they're miraculously sustained for 2,500 years according to ahadith for Nuh alayhi salam, and that's not something difficult for Allah to do. So it's not far-fetched for Imam al-Hujjah to live for a couple of thousand years or more, depending on what Allah sees as necessary. It's not that we're trying to scramble to figure out how to solve this problem and let's make up some story, make up some myth to solve this problem. This is the way Allah Himself has laid things out. So that's just something to be aware of as you engage with other narratives or other analyses of our history, that we don't fall into crisis when we see a non-believer, a secular person, analyze things very differently from how we ourselves, in the guidance of the Imams, how we understand our own history. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let me make one brief comment, and then I want to take a look at this dua from Sayfa Sajadiyah about the companions. All of the companions that I looked at during these lectures were males. Right? We didn't talk about any women, except by the way, maybe Fatima bint Asad, or some people came into the story. A lady Khadija came into the story just by the way, but we didn't focus on any female individuals. So part of this is the reality that there weren't prominent companions. They weren't, for instance, mixed gatherings where you'd have women also coming to the imam or sitting in classes with the imam and taking dictation and these kinds of things, interacting the same way. It was a man's world, and this was the study and the recording primarily happened through men. But there were women who were very knowledgeable, who were transmitters of traditions, who did have their own sessions with the imams and would narrate traditions. But I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the role that women played, even if you look at Lady Fatima, if you look at Lady Khadija alayhi salam, they don't fulfill the same kind of role that you might expect when you understand what their position is, what their status is. Right? We think that, okay, they are the best of all women, they have this enormous status, they're knowledgeable, they're living with the Prophet, they're learning everything that he has to teach. They should be just like Imam Ali alayhi salam, just like Imam Hassan and Hussein should be these other women who are in the close family of the Prophet. That understanding of their status is in one place, but they do not live public lives. They don't sit in the masjid and give lectures and dictate ahadith the way, for instance, Aisha did. Right? Al-Mu'minin Aisha, she used to do this. She would sit in the masjid and she would have whatever nominal hijab in front of her to abide by the verse of Surah Al-Ahzab, but then she would dictate. She was one of the few people who was allowed to narrate ahadith during this ban imposed by Umar, which lasted for 100 years against narrating any of the ahadith of Rasulullah. She was one of the few people who was given permission to narrate. And so she does this, and because of that, you see her as a narrator in Sunni ahadith. She's one of the prominent narrators of their ahadith. But the righteous women of Ahlul Bayt did not do this. They were not public people. They did not come out into in public and mix with men and speak to men. They lived a very private life, and they lived a life of extreme virtue, and they did their roles, but in a private sphere. We see them come out only in emergencies when there's no choice, and we see that, for instance, Lady Zainab has to come out because there's no choice, or her mother, Lady Fatima, has to come out in the aftermath of the stealing of Fadak. Because there's no one else to speak up for her right, then she has to come in public and speak. But besides that, we don't see them ever voluntarily coming out in public and amongst men and fulfilling this role. So it's a little bit challenging, I think, when we see that there's an absence of women narrators, then we think that maybe women had no role to play. Maybe they didn't know anything. There's not a correlation between those two things. The fact that they're not in the public sphere doesn't mean that they didn't know anything. It doesn't mean that they weren't also very knowledgeable and actively learning and even actively teaching and discussing amongst themselves. But that part of the reality doesn't get recorded in history, because history records the public sphere for the most part. Just like journalism now, it doesn't come and narrate what happens in my household or your household in the private sphere. If there's something public that happens, a public event or a statement, then that gets picked up by news media, by journalists. So history is the archiving of journalism, and it only sees the public sphere. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. One of the inspirations for this talk was the verse number 100 from Surah At-Tawbah that I've been beginning each of the lectures with, وَالسَّابِقُونَ الْأَوَّلُونَ. The other is this dua number 4 in Sahifa Sajadiyah. Imam Sajjad begins Sahifa Sajadiyah according to the order that we have from him. He begins by praising Allah, then he praises the Prophet, and then he praises the angels, and the fourth dua is about the Musaddiqur Rusul, those who confirmed, those who affirmed the messages and the mission of the prophets. This is about the companions. And I want to just read some excerpts from this dua so we get a sense of Imam Sajjad's praise of these people. He highlights the services that they did, and correlating to that is our indebtedness to them. And that's something we have to recognize. And hopefully, we'll accomplish some of that through these talks, that we understand what kind of amazing people these companions were of the Prophet, of the Imams, and what kinds of sacrifices they made. So the Imam puts a finger on some of those sacrifices to help us to feel that great indebtedness. And we're praying to Allah to shower His mercy on these individuals because of all these sacrifices they made for His sake. And we are the beneficiaries of those sacrifices. So there are 4 categories of companions that the Imam puts a finger on. The first, he goes back in history and he says all of those atba'ur rusul and musaddiqur rusul, the followers and the confirmers of all the prophets from Adam's time until Rasulullah's time. First he puts a finger on them and praises them. Then he turns to wa ashabu Muhammadin khassatan, the companions of Rasulullah in particular. I call down Allah's prayers on them. Then he looks to the tabi'un. Right, even the verse, he's like, that's one of the very important things about Sahifa Sajadiyah. If you are literate in Quran, and then you read this dua or other important duas from the Imams, you see the correlation between the wording. You can see that the dua is taking from this phrase and that phrase from the Quran, and it's building on Quranic paradigms and vocabulary, and using that to talk about these different issues. And so just like in the verse from Surah At-Tawbah, it's as-sabiqun al-awwalun min al-muhajiri wal-ansar wal-ladhina taba'uhum. So that first category are those who were companions of Rasulullah, the ashab amongst the muhajirin and ansar, and then al-ladhina taba'uhum are the tabi'un. So the terminology that we use in our history as well. The companions are the ones who had contact with Rasulullah, Muhammadur Rasulullah wal-ladhina ma'ahu, those who were with him. And then the tabi'un are the next generation who didn't have the blessing of being in his presence, but they benefited secondhand from the companions of Rasulullah. So this he expands, الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ. That bi-ihsan is important, right? It's not just anyone who followed them, anyone who learned from them. It's those who learned from them and followed in their footsteps well, correctly, the way they should have. Even Muhammadur Rasulullah وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ, Rasulullah and those who are with him. Those who are with him are those who are actually with him, step by step, following in his footsteps, doing as he told them to do. Not just those who are in his presence, who saw him once, who saw him and then opposed him, who saw him and rejected him, who saw him and then corrupted his teachings. Those are not people who are ma'ahu, who are with him. Those who are with him are those who absorb his teachings, who embody his teachings, who do their best to learn from him and then carry forth with the teachings that they get from him. So this idea that floats around in the followers of the khulafa, that anyone who saw the Prophet is blessed and guided and is a source of guidance for us. They're like stars in the heavens that we can seek guidance from any one of them, whether they were good or bad or knowledgeable or less knowledgeable. That is a completely bogus kind of a claim. Illogical, kind of far from any experience that we have. Just because people are with a person doesn't mean that they automatically become holy and kind of by osmosis become like that person. We have munafiqun amongst the Sahaba, just as we have people who are at the utmost of faith, like Miqdad and Salman. And then finally, the fourth group is from here on out. So we pray for all the tabi'un in the future as well, until the Day of Judgment. So we're going all the way back into history from Adam's time, all the companions, then the companions of Rasulullah, then the tabi'un of those companions until our time, and then from our time until the end of time, we're praying for them as well. So you see what a comprehensive categorization this is, and how important the idea of being a companion of the prophets and imams, and then being a follower of those companions is for the imam. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So it seems like these four first du'as of Sahifa Sajadiyah go together, because each one starts with a continuation of the previous du'a. He says, Allahumma wa atba'u rusul wa musaddiquhum min ahli al-ard bil ghayb. O Allah, as for the followers of all of the messengers and those who confirmed the messengers from all of the people of the earth, and those who confirmed them bil ghayb, not through tangibly being able to verify things with their senses, but through their intellects, through their understanding, they're able to confirm that they're speaking the truth about God who is in the unseen, and about a world that is in the unseen, and a paradise that is in the unseen. They were able to confirm through rational means and through understanding what these prophets were saying. عند معارضة المعاندين لهم بالتكذيب. Right? Despite the fact that they were facing constant opposition from those who were stubborn and those who were opposed. That's another important part of the virtue of these companions, was that they were able to believe and follow despite the fact that it was a matter of life and death for them. We typically don't feel that kind of desperation in our pursuit of our Islamic learning and our Islamic way of life. Most of us are in this blessed time and place where we are able to live our lives as Muslims, and nobody ever threatens our life. Nobody ever threatens our safety. Nobody ever does anything to oppose us. And we're in this really privileged position. This is just an anomaly of history. And we should look into history and see how difficult it was for people throughout the ages to be believers. And look in our world itself and look around the world and see how difficult it is for other people to be believers. So if we have this little anomalous type of a situation where we can be believers and not have such life and death situations where we have to choose between Iman and our life, we should appreciate that as a great blessing in one way, but it can also lead to weakness. It can also lead to taking faith for granted. It's not so important for us if you believe or don't believe. Sometimes it seems like it's just a very superficial part of our existence. He goes forward, في كل دهر وزمان أرسلت فيه رسولا وأقمت لأهله دليلا من لدن آدم إلى محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. So he's praising those companions and followers that in every time in which you sent a Rasul, for whom you established clear proofs to point to his legitimacy, from the time of Adam until the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. من أئمة الهدى وقادة أهل التقى. He describes those prophets as imams of guidance, leaders of those who have taqwa. Even that is taken from the verse in Surah Al-Furqan, وجعل ربنا وجعل للمتقين إماما وجعلنا للمتقين إماما. Right? Make us leaders of those who have taqwa. And here he uses that same phrase in Sahifa Sajadiyah, that those prophets of old were all qadati ahl tuqa. They were the leaders of those who had taqwa. Ala jami'ihim as-salam. Our peace and our salutation on all of those companions of the prophets. We're not praying for the prophets themselves. That was in the previous dua, and the second dua. This is the fourth dua where we're praying for the companions of those prophets. فَاذْكُرْهُمْ مِنْكَ بِالْمَغْفِرَةِ وَرِضْوَانِ. We're calling out Allah's forgiveness and His pleasure on all of these companions and supporters of the prophets of old. The second group, Allahumma wa ashabu Muhammadin khassatan. The companions of Rasulullah in particular, الَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا الصَّحَابَةِ. Those who were good, who did a good job in their companionship of the Prophet. Right? So this is not praise of all of the companions, this is praise of the righteous of the companions. So this is also something that we sometimes fall into this trap. You know how we typically will start any khutbah, any address with calling down salawat on individuals. Right? We'll say salawat on the Prophet and on the Ahlul Bayt, and then our Sunni brethren will say on the companions and on the wives of the Prophet. They'll add those as well. So this is something that we have to be careful. First of all, there's no reason for doing that. We have no evidence for why we should call down that same salawat that we call down on the Prophet and the Imams and the Ahlul Bayt on companions or on other people. But the more important distinction to make is if we do feel the need to call it down, maybe following this dua of Sahifa Sajadiyah, we should make it clear that it's a subset of the companions. Not ala sahbihi ajma'in, for instance, on all of his companions. So one of the things that you'll see our Shi'i ulama who have to interact with Sunnis do is they'll say ashabihil muntajabin or sahbihil muntajabin. So if you bring an adjective like that, you're talking about the select of the companions. And this is actually a very good kind of tawriya. Tawriya is a way of lying to, it's a double entendre. Double entendre means you say something that has two meanings. You intend one thing, and the person you're speaking to understands something different. So if you're speaking to Sunnis in a Sunni gathering and you want to kind of bring them in and connect with them, then you can say something like ashabihil muntajabin, because what he hears is we're calling all of the ashab muntajab. And what we intend is that there is a subset amongst the ashab who are muntajab, and we're calling down salawat on them. Is that clear? So it can be a qaid, it's called a qaid tawdihi or a qaid ihtirazi. It's a restrictive or non-restrictive. So they understand it's a non-restrictive. Every single sahabi is muntajab, is specially chosen. And you're calling down salawat on all of them, when actually what we're saying, which is what makes sense, we're calling down salawat or we're calling down mercy and all of these things on the select of the companions, not the companions who are all select. Right? So that's an adab to be aware of. If you use that sort of a phrase, don't fall into that trap of saying sahbihi ajma'in, for instance. Say sahbi al-muntajabin. That's one way to very carefully say the right thing while also building bridges with people who respect the companions so that they can, not be turned off immediately and sit in the gathering, not be offended, and then maybe listen to something good that's said and something might spark strike a chord with them. الَّذِينَ أَبْلَوُوا الْبَلَاءَ الْحَسَنِ فِي نَصْرِهِ. Like these companions, these are some of the debts that we owe them. These companions of Rasulullah, if you look at the kind of balaya that they faced in the way of establishing the deen and defending the Prophet and fighting his wars, they gave their lives. They gave up everything. They gave their own money. They sacrificed themselves. They separated from family. He actually mentioned some of these. وَكَانَفُوهُ وَأَسْرَعُوا إِلَى وِفَادَتِهِ وَسَابَقُوا إِلَى دَعْوَتِهِ وَاسْتَجَابُوا لَهُ حَيْثُ أَسْمَعَهُمْ حُجَّةَ رِسَالَتِهِ وَفَارَقُوا الْأَزْوَاجَ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. They separated themselves. They gave up their own families, their own children, their own wives for the sake of the deen. They converted, for instance, in Mecca. Their wives and children didn't agree, so they left their families behind and they did hijrah and came to Rasulullah and lost their whole family and their homes and their wealth and everything for the sake of the truth. وَفَارَقُوا الْأَزْوَاجَ وَالْأَوْلَادَ فِي إِظْهَارِ كَلِمَتِهِ. Just for making his teachings thrive, they gave up everything. وَقَاتَلُوا الْآبَاءَ وَالْأَبْنَاءَ فِي تَثْبِيتِ نُبُوَّتِهِ. They fought against their own fathers and their own brothers to establish the prophethood of Rasulullah. That's something, right at Badr we see the first instance of that, with Abu Hudhayfa ibn Utbah fighting against Utbah and Walid. Utbah ibn Rabi'a, the father of Hind, he is one of the people who comes out as the champion to challenge the Muslims. He brings his son Walid, the brother of Hind, onto the battlefield. And in the ranks of the Muslims, when he challenges, one of the people who volunteers is his own son, Abu Hudhayfa. And Rasulullah tells him to go back. He says, I don't want you to kill your own father, kill your own brother. He appreciates his intentions, he prays for him, but he doesn't allow him to come forth. And then some Ansar volunteer. Rasulullah also pushes them back, and the Quraysh are not happy with Ansar coming forth. And then finally, Rasulullah brings out Imam Ali and Hamza and Abu Ubaidah, who's not Banu Hashim but from Banu Muttalib, and the three of them fight. But this is Abu Hudhayfa. He's willing to even fight his own father and brother. And we're told that in the aftermath of Badr, when they basically dump all of the bodies of the mushrikeen into one of the dry wells of Badr, Abu Hudhayfa is seen there looking at the bodies of his own father, his own brother, his own uncle, all of whom were killed right at the outset of the battle. And Rasul sees in his eyes something, and he asks him, do you have some regret? What are you feeling right now as you see these bodies? And he says, I have no regret. He shows such stoicism. He says, the only thing I'm feeling is the sense that I had such high hopes for my father. He was a sensible person. Actually, he was a very sensible person. Even the Prophet, as Utbah comes into the battlefield, he says, if anyone in that army has sense, it's that person on top of the red camel that he was riding. He points to Utbah. He was the sensible one. He was trying to sue for peace. He was trying to say we shouldn't fight. It was Abu Jahl who kept on prodding him, poking him, and getting him all riled up. And finally he challenged him so much that he said, fine, just to prove that I'm not a coward, I'm going to go and fight. And he tells his brother and his son to go, and they go into the battlefront and are killed right away. But he had the sense, he was thinking in the right way to avoid fighting. And so Abu Hudayfa says, I had hopes that my father would come around and he would believe, and now I see that all those hopes are dashed. I see his inflated, bloated body rotting here in this grave, and I think, what a shame. He could have been guided. But Abu Hudayfa had that kind of resolve. He didn't waver in his commitment to the deen just because he saw that his father and his brother and his uncle are on the other side. So that's one example of many of people who are willing to put everything on the line, fight against their own fathers and brothers, kill them even, not personally because Rasulullah didn't allow that to happen, but fight against them for the sake of establishing the prophethood of the Prophet. So he names some of these things and he says, فَلَا تَنْسَ لَهُمُ اللَّهُمَّ مَا تَرَكُوا لَكَ وَفِيكَ. Oh Allah, don't forget all that they abandoned for your sake. وَأَرْضِهِمْ مِنْ رِضْوَانِكَ. Give them of your special pleasure in paradise. وَاشْكُرْهُمْ عَلَى هَجْرِهِمْ فِيكَ دِيَارَ قَوْمِهِمْ. The fact that they did hijrah and they had to leave their hometowns and their homelands. Because I mentioned this a few days ago, hijrah it's not just people from Mecca coming to Medina. Hijrah was one of the requirements in the early days for being a Muslim. When you said your shahada, you had to do hijrah as well. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يُهَاجِرُوا مَا لَكُم مِّن وَلَايَتِهِم مِّن شَيْءٍ حَتَّى يُهَاجِرُوا. Those people who believed, but they didn't do hijrah, they were not fully Muslim. They had none of the privileges of being a Muslim muhajir if they chose to stay where they were. Until they finally did hijrah, then they would become fully fledged Muslims. Until Fathu Mecca, la hijrata ba'd al-Fath. Once Fathu Mecca takes place, then there's no more requirement for hijrah. But in this period from the hijrah of the Prophet until Fathu Mecca, everyone had to do hijrah. They had to leave everything. From wherever they were coming from, if they wanted to convert, they had to leave everything or get a special dispensation from Rasulullah to be able to stay a little bit longer and take care of something. And then they would do hijrah when they were able to. So that kind of sacrifice that they made, that's something that we should appreciate, and we're asking Allah to show His special favor to them because of these sacrifices they made. Then we say, Allahumma wa awsil ila tabi'ina lahum bi ihsan. Also grant your special favors to the tabi'een of those companions of Rasulullah who followed well in the companionship, in the path. الذين يقولون ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان. Those who say this dua and ask forgiveness for those brethren who came before them in their faith. So they're connected, they're in the same line. They're praying for the Sahaba, and they're also therefore in the same line as those righteous Sahaba, following well in their footsteps. So we ask him to give khayra jazaika, give your best reward to them. And finally, we talk about all of the people who, going forward from our time until the end, who will be on this path. We say, I'll read the translation of William Chittick for this. O God, and bless the followers from this day of ours to the day of doom. This inshallah includes us now. We're praying not only for some third person individual, we're praying for ourselves. We want to now aspire to be in this line of those who are tabi'un, of the tabi'een, of the sahaba, of Rasulullah, bi ihsan, on the right path. So we're praying for ourselves as we're praying for all these individuals until the day of judgment. From this day of ours to the end of time, bless the followers, their wives, their offspring, and those among them who obey you with a blessing through which you will preserve them from disobeying thee. Make room for them in the plots of your garden. Defend them from the trickery of shaitan. Help them in their piety in which they seek help from you. Protect them from sudden events that come by night and day, except the events which come with good. And incite them to tie firmly the knot of good hope in you. Desire what is with you, and refrain from ill thoughts toward you because of what the hands of your servants hold. Let them not get distracted by what people have from what you have. Let them only see what you have and be able to turn away from the rewards of the dunya for the sake of the rewards of the akhirah that are in your hands. Thus you may restore them to beseeching you and fearing you, induce them to renounce the plenty of the immediate, make them love to work for the sake of the deferred. Let them give up the immediate and go for the deferred, which is what's in the hereafter, what's later. And prepare for what comes after death. Make easy for them every distress that comes to them on the day when souls take leave from bodies. Release them from that which brings about the perils of temptation and being thrown down in the fire and staying forever there, within it. And take them to security, the resting place of the God-fearing. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, accept whatever efforts we've made during this month of Ramadan to worship you, to learn about your deen, to learn the stories of the most righteous of your prophets and Imam's companions. Help us to learn good lessons from them, to follow in their footsteps everywhere that they tread well, to avoid the mistakes that they made. Help us to be righteous followers of those companions, and let us also be great companions, inshallah, and loyal companions to our own Imam, to our own Hujjah, to our own Ma'soom of our time, to be his loyal companions and his supporters, to sacrifice whatever we have for his sake and his success. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.